I'm Tim Ventura, and we're joined today by Dr. Namrata Goswami, an independent scholar on international relations, subject matter expert with the Futures Laboratory, and co-author of the new book, Scramble for the Skies. She joins us today to discuss the book, which focuses on the economic ambitions of the second space race and the financial and international competition driving it forward. Namrata, welcome. I'd like to start out by asking you a bit about your background and your current projects, as well as what inspired you to become an expert in international relations and the space industry. What led you down this path in your career?
Thank you, Tim. That's a great way to start. So I remember even as growing up in Northeast India, my father had this interesting library. He was very much a historian looking at world politics and international relations. So even growing up, we had conversations on the Second World War, the impact of international relations and colonization on India. And so I remember at that time, I expressed an interest to study political science and international relations. And so from high school onwards, I chose topics that developed that expertise. And so I joined a bachelor's program in political science with international relations as my specialization. And then I did a master's in politics and public administration, where again, I specialized in international relations. So I think the core, my deepest interest in this subject, as you see, has been very long-term. And then looking at state relations interested me, looking at strategic culture interested me, as well as international politics. But I realized that if you want to become an expert in this, it's important to have further education. And so I did a PhD in international organization from Jawaharlal-Nehru University in India, where I again specialize in conflict resolution and international relations. So that's how it's been a long journey.
Yeah, it sounds like it. It sounds like it, but lots of expertise as well, right? So you know, and I think it's definitely taken you to a pivotal place at a pivotal time, you know, to be able to talk about these things. So let's dive into your new book, Scramble for the Skies. Now, this examines what you're calling the second space race, and it has a focus on China, the United States, and India. I'm wondering, can you give me a brief overview of the book, why people should read it, and why you chose the space efforts in those nations to focus on?
Sure, thank you. So this book grew out of one of my paper presentations in the International Studies Association conference, where I spoke on China's space program. And so there was interest shown by Roman and Littlefield. So that was the start of it, but I should go a bit further. So the presentation itself grew out of Peter and my application for a MINERVA grant with the US Department of Defense. And so we succeeded in getting the grant. And so the book is about looking at the change of discourse in regard to space. So I argue that space in the Cold War was a lot about flags and footprints, about showing off technology for impact on Earth as to which is the more attractive ideology. Is it the US-led world order or the Soviet-led world order? And if you remember that famous Sputnik launch and everything that happened after that. So, so the argument that I make is that today, and we both make, because Peter is a co-author, so we both make this argument that based on observations on fieldwork that we did in China and India, talking to policymakers, academics, space scientists, including international relations experts, there was a sense that the discourse was changing from looking at space just as a terrestrial support-based infrastructure, for instance, satellite support, navigation support, Earth observation, to making space much more interested in terms of long-term development of sustainability in terms of human presence. So the book makes that argument based on the interviews that we did in China and also in India. But what was interesting is that I think why readers would find the book interesting is that there are detailed chapters looking at elite discourse. So by elite, we mean those who have impact on academic framing, policy making, that there is a shift from looking at space in terms of something we just look at and feel awe and inspiration to a discourse where space is seen as part of the economy. in terms of looking at space from adding to your economy. And there are detailed chapters on how this elite discourse actually shifted to become a policy discourse. And then once the policy discourse happened, how it actually led to the creation of programs. So this includes chapters on US, China, India, where we do a very detailed analysis of that shift. And then we also make the argument that the UAE and Luxembourg, despite the fact that they are not great powers in space, but middle powers that influence norm constitution, influence space policy via the United Nations, actually is also playing an important role in terms of how this discourse is going about. And I think why readers should read the book is because the last chapter offers future scenarios based on our observation historically, today, and into the future, and how that future might actually look like in terms of space commercialization.
Ah, okay. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't mention your co-author, and you've already brought him up, Pete Gerritsen, the former United States Air Force chief futurist, and he's also been a long-term proponent of space commercialization. I'm wondering, as you were writing this, what kinds of expertise did you both contribute to it, and how did you delegate the responsibilities, between yourselves? I guess I'm just wondering kind of what your experience was writing it with him as well.
Well, I think first we conceive of so what we have to do is when you start writing a book, you have to first write the proposal so that the publisher can have a look at it. And then you have to send across a chapter for peer review. So it goes through a process. So both Peter and me conceive of the proposal together. We both actually agreed that the discourse on space was changing from looking at it, as I mentioned, from prestige dimension to more human settlement dimension. And so, given the fact that we agreed on that particular basic premise, it was not very difficult to then craft the proposal in terms of looking at discourses within the different countries. What Peter brought to the project was his own experience in the US government, which I didn't have, in terms of space policy, even the framing of discourses from the practitioner perspective. So what Peter could bring is that, okay, we have a particular conversation, but what is it that the policymaker would be interested in? Will the policymaker be interested in mapping out very long visualistic scenarios without really offering a pathway as to how we got there? And in terms of what intervening variables might be required. And I think so what we did is that we divided the chapters based on his expertise on the US. And so I brought in my expertise on Asia, which is China, India, and looking at their programs. But we also converge in terms of looking at the theoretical chapters together. So building the framing of the chapters, which we both brought our expertise together. And the most important thing is that you have to have a clear timeline and delegation of authority in terms of who is going to otherwise it cannot, it's very important in the beginning to set out a roadmap in terms of even days and months. So, okay, within this particular days, we need to finish this. Within this month, we need to finish this. So since we kind of agreed on those, timelines, and we were forced to because the publisher had a timeline as well. So.
Yeah. Well, and so now you'd mentioned that this originally came out of a MINERVA grant to analyze China and India's space programs for the DoD. And I guess the focus of that, from what I found, is you had a focus on strategic cultures, goals and ambitions, and then their track record of success in achieving them. So I'm wondering if I could jump into what you learned through that grant, especially about the space programs of those two nations.
Absolutely. So the MINERVA grant was very useful, especially for me because I was then able to do field work. And so as well as my co-author. So what I learned from looking at the literature. So before we even started the field work, I was doing literature survey on what the Chinese space policy makers and their state-funded space institutions are talking about in terms of long-term goals. And so there were 3 goals that emerged based on that literature survey, looking at for instance, China National Space Administration's roadmap, which is their main policy-making body, and then the China Academy of Space Technology's roadmap. So that meant that I had to look at Chinese sources, including Xinhua and China Daily and the People's Liberation Army Daily. And then what we did is we then talked about this to presentations were made to the China, different think tanks, roundtables where there were policymakers from China National Space Administration. So there were three goals that I learned emerged from this particular exercise for China and India. For China, it seemed that China was actually looking at space in a very long-term perspective, even much more than India. So for China, 2049 was an end goal in terms of the fact that the People's Republic of China was established on October 1st, 1949. And on October 1st, 2049, they'll be celebrating 100 years. And so that, for China, it's a very important part of their celebration in terms of ensuring that the population of China gets the message that the Communist Party of China has been successful. And space was included as one of the most important goals. And President Xi made it very clear that space is equivalent to the spirit of the Long March. And for those who look at history, we will immediately get the significance, because Mao's Long March led to the establishment of the communist-led People's Republic of China. So he was equating that. He said that that spirit, that Chinese citizens will go to space and establish a moon base or engage in mineral extraction, is equivalent to what Mao did in terms of the Long March. So I learned that particular significant insight. The second insight I learned is that unlike the US or even say India, which is a democracy, China has an advantage in terms of its ability to commit long-term resources. So for example, to make that point a bit more clearer, so the China Lunar Exploration Program, the thinking for it started in 2002. So before it was even established as a program. So Li Keqiang and Shi Shuang, both of them head scientists and basically leading the thinking on the moon, made the argument that if China wants to become a spacefaring civilization, the moon becomes of strategic value because the moon is close. We don't need much time to get to the moon. Second, the moon has resources like water ice. At that time, not confirmed. Remember, the confirmation of water ice happened in 2008 with the Chandrayaan-1 mission. But we knew that there would be there, but we hadn't yet discovered it. But so Yi Peiqiang basically pointed out that there is water ice on the lunar poles. And so if China does not think about establishing a lunar program, it's going to be in a disadvantage. So that's the thing I learned, that they spoke about it nearly 20 years ago. Then they established their program in 2007. And there was a continuous focus on developing lunar capacity. Now, compare this to the US space program. So under Bush Jr., we had a focus on the moon, where the vision for space exploration came out, and basically that the moon is important. And then we had President Obama come back, who said that, no, we have already been to the moon, been there, done that. Let's go look at asteroids or something else, or Mars. And then we had President Trump come in, who said that it's a moon to Mars. So you have change of mission goals. But China doesn't seem to be having that. They continue with that particular focus. The third thing I learned is that they are very seriously considering looking at space from an economic perspective. So they talk about a 10 trillion return annually from the Earth-Moon economic zone. They are establishing programs that sustain those goals that they are actually talking about in the next 20 years. And what is so interesting is that there seems to be a pattern of behavior that told me that very similar arguments were made about their Chang'e 4 landing, that they would do it, say in 2016, they said they'll land in 2019, and they actually accomplished that. In 2010, they said they'll have a cargo spacecraft, and they achieved that exactly on time. In 1990, they said that they will send manned missions to low Earth orbit in the 2000s, and they achieved that. So that told me that we need to take their stated goals seriously, because once they put it out in the public, there are serious programs that are established then to support it. Now, quickly about India. And so, of course, asteroid mining was one of their goals. Lunar permanent base was a goal, and Mars exploration missions. As we know, they launched a Mars mission this year. And so in India's case, it was not as long-term. So India envisioned by 2025 to develop heavy lift capability, lunar missions, including a resource prospecting mission in cooperation with Japan. But I didn't see the same kind of space resource discourses coming out of India as I saw in China. So there was a bit difference in terms of the focus area.
Ah, okay. Now, you know, one of the things that I think is interesting about this book is you guys are really throwing down the gauntlet and saying the second space race is already underway. And in this scramble for the skies, as you very appropriately described it as, it's really a race for key resources in space. So what do you think some of the most important resources are that the competitors are focused on? And do you think that will change in the next few years?
So the two resources, at least I can speak about the lunar surface. So the two resources, actually almost all countries, including Japan, India, are talking about is helium-3. That's critical for nuclear fusion. Most countries are concentrating on water ice. And as we know, water ice is critical. So if you're talking about life support system, propulsion system, you can use water ice for that particular perspective. So they're talking about that. The other resources that they are concentrating on is, of course, rare earth minerals, which are abandoned on the moon, say titanium, platinum, iron ore, silicon. And what is insightful is that China is actually talking about it from a very strategic perspective. So their argument is that once we are able to establish presence, say, on the South Pole, we also have the peaks of eternal light. So you need to have a base which is close to sunlight because you need that power generation. And second, you also need to be able to sustain human presence by oxygen, water, which is critical. So those are the resources that most countries are focusing on at present. And I would say that the scramble has already started because in my point of view, in the US, the discourse on looking at resources outside of Earth, say on an asteroid or on the moon, actually was started by Paul Spudis and Dennis Wingo, who talked about the resources on the moon. Paul Spudis, who's no more excellent thinker and scientist, he pointed out that if humanity wants to become a spacefaring civilization, we need to have the capability to sustain ourselves on the moon and then go ahead. So the discourse was already there, but it was not at the policy level. But China picked it up for some reason. And they picked it up before even the US or say Russia picked it up. In the Cold War, there were, of course, discussions and programs on this, but it was not sustained. So once China started talking about the moon and how important it is, we now see a response, I would say a reaction to the Chinese program. So you can see it from the Trump administration space policy directives 1, 2, 3, 4. They have a fifth one now, which talks about the value of the moon. And then Mike Pence's speech in the 5th National Space Council in Huntsville, where he said that we need to go back to the moon, not just from human landing, but also because it's rare. It has so much resources that will sustain our deep space exploration. And then you have now what is interesting in terms of the scramble is that you now have countries talking about the ability of, say, you and me, for instance, if we are space entrepreneurs and we have a mining moon company, that we are able to own those resources without appropriating sovereignty. So you have the Commercial Space Launch Competitive Act, signed by Obama. And then you had President Trump's April 6th, 2020 executive order that said that American citizens can own resources on the moon or on a lunar surface or on an asteroid. So, and so I see that suddenly countries are waking up to this possibility. And I think China kicked it off. So India is now talking about prospecting on the moon in cooperation with Japan, which it was not talking about in terms of its Chandrayaan mission. It was more about exploration. So I think this is why I call it a scramble, because the language matters. And so the language is no more just about space science and exploration. It's become about space resource utilization and development. So the language is changing as well.
Well, and in terms of the scramble, now NASA is scrambling to land the first woman and the next man on the moon in 2024. And they also have plans for the Lunar Gateway Station and then human explorers to the lunar surface after that. So right now, it seems, I mean, today, a lot of this competition in space is focused in Earth orbit. But I'm wondering, when do you see that changing more to this moon focus that you've mentioned?
I think it's already changing. So you can already see the focus change. So of course, I didn't answer the second part of your question, earlier question, where you said that what might change in the next, say, from today to say 10 years later. What could change is that this is 2020, say 16 years from now, we will have a Chinese research base on the moon. That's what their goal is by 2036. You have Russia, the Roscosmos, come out with I think just recently that they would want to have a similar base in collaboration with China through their Luna 25, where they're looking at resource prospecting and establishing a human settlement. And Russia is as a very important spacefaring nation. It gave us so much of the technology or introduced mankind to it, right?
Yes.
So, and so we shouldn't actually, we cannot write Russia off because of the fact that they do have the capability and the expertise. So in the next 16 years, I would see much more commercial development, private sector coming in terms of developing capability like in situ resource manufacturing. I would see use of robotics and artificial intelligence in terms of accessing the resources of the moon before, say, you and I can go there or humans can go there. You would see, I would see that there would be extraction of or beaming of solar power even from point to point in space, which the Chinese are at present. They have a solar power plant today that is trying to develop microwave transmission of energy and in situ construction of solar power satellites. We know that the Air Force Research Laboratory has a similar program, SPIDER, that's looking at, space-based solar power. And Paul Jaffe, I think his experiment went up to on the X-37 to study a similar kind of technology. So we can see that the next 10 years, I see changes that will be exponential, and we need to be aware of that. Now, in terms of, so can you repeat the question that you, the second question? Yeah.
Well, yeah, and I think you answered it really well. It was, when are we going to start to see this transition from the, the LEO, right, which is, we have ISS and things like that, when we'll start to see that towards the moon. Now, I also wanted to ask about when that begins to move further out, because we have Elon Musk, right, who's interested in Mars colonization. And I think, as you've mentioned, and many others have looked at, there's the prospect of asteroid mining. So Elon Musk has been very adamant about his goals for the red planet. And again, in terms of asteroids, there are lots of materials available, and those are relatively easy to mine, I guess, in space. So when do you think that we'll start to see more competition for those?
I would say in the time frame of 2035, 2040. You'll start seeing a lot of competition for moving from the moon to, say, asteroid extraction, and then a human base on Mars. So as you said, Elon Musk basically points out that he's investing in SpaceX or even Tesla because his ultimate goal is to have a million populated city on Mars, right? By 2075, I think. That's very ambitious, but what that would lead to is that it would lead to the development of capability. And in history, we see, entrepreneurs or investors talk about long-term goals, and they actually achieve the incremental technology to get there. A similar focus on reusability, if people remember the debate, it was a lot of people pointed out that it's not possible. Reusability or reusable rockets can never happen, never see in our lifetime. Till the time we had SpaceX, Blue Origin actually showed it first in suborbital space, and then SpaceX, November and December 2015. So I think in terms of looking at asteroids and Mars, in terms of actual base or human presence or the capability to extract resources, I would see the development of the technology, say by 2035, 2040. And I would think that what would happen before that is that it will not just be the US that will be prospecting the Martian surface. We have a Chinese mission that has 3 goals that is on its way to Mars and will land in February 2021. One of the goals is, of course, to get into the Martian orbit. Second is to have a lander, and third is a rover that's actually that has capabilities to prospect the Martian surface for its resources. So, and you see India wants to have a second mission as well to Mars. UAE also has a mission that's on its way to Mars. So, and of course that doesn't have the landing mission. They want to get into Martian orbit to study Martian environment. So I think that we already see a start of countries beyond the great powers actually wanting to go to Mars. And I think 2040, 2045 will be critical.
Yeah. Well, and now this isn't in the questions I pre-wrote. I just want to preface this, but
yeah,
as you mentioned, the missions to Mars, the Perseverance probe, right? The Perseverance robotic probe is up there, and they have a very large sensor kit in place to look for signs of life. What I'm wondering is, I think the mission starts next February, right? When Perseverance lands. So give it a couple of months. We may have, for the first time in human history, the announcement of life on another planet. If that does come back positive, and I know there will be a lot of discussion, debate, and wrangling about the results, do you think that would move up the timelines for Mars?
Well, that will be, from a strategic perspective, that would be, I don't know if we have conversations about the ethics of it, right? So if there's life on another planet, does humanity have the ethical right or entitlement to then go and settle there, right? Because of the history of colonialism and all that impact that had on humanity. But that would have two effects. One, first of all, depends on what we find out about that life and what capability that life form has. Second, it could have two effects. One, it could have a very exhilarating effect of finding that we are not alone in the universe, which is a scary prospect, that there is some other life. And so we can feel spiritual connection that, okay, there is life in another planet, and thereby actually exhilarate programs, as you said, in terms of timelines. But not as much as what I'm talking about, 2035, 2040. Now, if the life form is seen, because depends on what kind of life form. So for instance, if we discover life form and that life form discovers us, whatever form it is, there could be the science fiction scenario where Earth might get exceptionally fearful and might actually create a national security crisis and in terms of how vulnerable Earth is, right? And so then that might itself accelerate timelines as well.
Yeah.
Because then, right, so strategically you might want to have more understanding, more control. So power. So
well, and I think the Perseverance instrument packages are looking for something kind of like a bacterial or fungus,
right.
and then I think they're also looking for signs of ancient life as well. So,
right.
But I know, like from what I've read, they're betting on salt brines. That's something that they're hoping for, and those are kind of buried into the surface. So I think if they do find something, it will be very simplistic, but I think the spiritual connection you mentioned, I know that's something I've given thought to, what does this mean, not being alone in the universe? And I guess we can't really answer it yet, but hopefully we'll have a better answer next March.
Yeah, because even if you discover the simplest of life forms, there are discourses all over the world, in Europe, wherever I participate, in India, or even in Mongolia, where you have a company like Mars V that talks about going to Mars. There is this, even if it's the most simplest, does humanity have the entitlement to then go there and do some activity that destroys that life form? So for example, if there is a particular area on Mars that's rich in a particular resource, and yet it has those simplest life forms. So then there is that ethical discussion that comes in, right? So can we go in? Some would argue that these are microbes, these are not, intelligent life forms, but it's a very interesting discourse to have. In fact, I'm glad you brought this up, because I'm reading this science fiction author of China, Xinjing Liu. I'm sure you heard of him, The Three Body Problem, Dark Forests. So I just finished reading his Dark Forest, and it's so interesting because it does talk about a trisolarian civilization that discovers Earth because of a message sent, continuing with the three-body problem. And then they actually engage in activity that is not very good for Earth. But what it does is that it brings Earthers, if I may use the term, together. Because they see a threat from outside, they actually start forming an Earth identity, including the Chinese Space Force, the American Space Fleet, and I think they had if I remember right, a North American Space Fleet. So it's interesting. We actually should be prepared thinking through those scenarios.
That's a good point. It's an excellent point. Well, and actually that brings us right to the idea of the Space Force, right? And I mean, but even without anything like that, with all of the emerging commercial activity, the plans for colonization, the exploration by competing nations, I know that your co-author, Pete Gerritsen, has been a longtime proponent of what he calls a blue water role for the Space Force to protect commerce and access to resources. I'm wondering, do you support this role for that organization, or do you think that they're probably better suited to more of what you might call a brown water or Earth-focused role, like protecting satellite orbits?
That's a great question, because as you know, that's the discourse today, that what should be the vision and function of the US Space Force. So in my perspective, if I look at the capstone doctrine that has recently come out, and I was reading it carefully to see how they are envisioning themselves before we jump to some conclusions. So one of the things that interested me is that the Space Force, of course, talks a lot about orbital space, space situational awareness, you know, battle ready for that kind of activity in low Earth orbit. And yet they also talk about cislunar, not as much, but they do talk about it. And recently, as you know, there was a memorandum of understanding, I think an MOU signed between NASA and the Space Force that looks into cislunar domain awareness. So in my perspective, so this is where I stand in this particular discourse. So I look at myself as a grand strategist. And so for me, I think both are important. That so it has to be comprehensive. You cannot say it should only focus on cislunar and beyond and neglect, say, your capability to ensure that your infrastructures on Earth are resilient, because we are dependent on space for even today, you know, talking on the internet, if we are supported by space-based internet, we're dependent on that. I'm dependent on space-based support for even traveling from one point in a particular city to another point because of GPS. 4 satellites help me do that. So I think it is important that we maintain the resilience of that structure, but that's very tactical. So, and that's my point. Even the fact that I look at it from a grand strategic perspective, I would say that that's a tactical means to achieve a particular end goal, and that is resilience of your current critical infrastructure, right? And
Yeah.
so, but the problem is that if the Space Force limits itself to just that, then anybody who's a strategic thinker should think through that, okay, the new era for space development that came out, the policy document that came out of the US, the White House and the National Space Council, talks about human settlement on the moon, talks about American citizens working in space, developing capability for that, talks about extraction, resources, utilization. Now, if that are the policy goals, it's really important that you have a service that is able to then offer security of communication, that is able to have cislunar space situational awareness, that in case a scenario could be that you have an American lunar mining company on the south pole of the moon, and there is dispute with a Chinese lunar mining company, and then in case their communication gets cut off, if you do not have a Space Force presence who has an independent communication system that cannot be hacked into, that company is in trouble, if you think about it.
Yeah.
So from a grand strategic perspective, I always go with, I might be critical of it, but that's not my role. My role is to offer guidance to, if you have a particular policy goal, first of all, can you reach that? And second, if you have that civilian goal, what is the role of your military in terms of enabling security? So I think there is a fundamental misunderstanding of the Space Force as well. So if you look at the common discourse, people think the moment you have a space force, it means weaponization of space. It means militarization of space. But historically, the role of any military, be it in the US or India, it's about providing security. So you have the Indian Navy in the Indian Ocean. They do a lot of, patrols. It's not because they want to have a conflict there. It's because they want to ensure that the ships that are traveling to the Indian ports have safety of navigation. So, and so the US Navy plays a very similar role in terms of freedom of navigation in the Pacific, the Malacca Straits, and elsewhere. And so if you are envisioning a future where you see settlement on the lunar surface or Mars and beyond, it's really important that you have a military service that is able to provide security and is able to ensure prosperity. And I think the military is a part of a nation's comprehensive identity. It's not the only end goal. So the United States does not exist, or the Space Force has not been established so that it has military superiority. That's the goal, one of the goals. But why do you want to have military superiority or some better space situational awareness? Is because you want to ensure that in case there is conflict, you are able to respond to it. But more importantly, in peacetime, you're able to sustain secure lanes of communication. And this actually gets reflected in the definition of space power in the capstone document. So their argument is that space power exists so that the military can actually ensure prosperity and security. And even more interestingly, they argue that it is also important for the US Space Force to be able to show capability in space and actually visibly show it so that allies feel reassured.
Yeah.
And, right, when they're engaging.
Now, and speaking of reassurance, and I am going to jump around on my questions a little bit, but this brings me to I did an interview with General Quast, retired military general, and he and several others have expressed concerns about China's threat to use EMPs and the dual use potential of space-based beam power and just other emerging capabilities that militarize space. So I guess given this growing militarization of space, and the increasing political tensions that we've seen, especially over the last year or so, should people here on Earth be concerned about space-based weapons or orbital strikes or God knows what?
Well, you bring out a good point with electromagnetic pulse, right? EMP. So there is concern. I mean, there was a lot of concern expressed with North Korea, a rogue state detonating a nuclear device 40 kilometers above the US mainland surface, and that creating, and the issue is that it's not about the entire system going out. It's like if you have one detonation and it takes out parts of your system, that affects your whole system. So I mean, I'm not an expert on EMP, but that's the understanding I have. So, and so in terms of a rogue nation using space for an orbital strike, there is always that scenario that we need to be aware of and be very much prepared for. Now, in terms of, if you look at China's behavior, so since your question is about should we be concerned? Now, even in terms of weaponization or dual use of a particular capability. So in 2016, China's put up in their Along launcher a debris remover. So this particular capability they launched, their basic argument was that because we created debris during their ASAT test in 2007, we are being responsible. So we are putting up a capability that is able to grab a debris and then clean that surface. But you see the danger of that is that you have a robotic arm that can also grab adversary communication satellite. So for example, today we have very tense relations in the Taiwan Straits, where China has actually broken the commitment to Taiwan that it will not get into Taiwan airspace, but it's done it because of the US senior officer landing there. So, so think of a situation that it has this capability, and in case there is conflict in Taiwan, let's hope it wouldn't happen, but just to play out a scenario. And so the US military's response is dependent on its space-based command and control. And so a Chinese capability might be able to grab that, command, might destroy it by kinetic capability or laser beaming, or blind it or jam it. so the dual capability is actually something that we need to be very much, and space-based infrastructure always has dual capabilities. A satellite coming close to another satellite, you know, a solar power beam, microwave beam targeting a particular satellite in terms of space warfare, missile defense systems used for kinetic launch, which is a big concern in terms of ASAT capability. And in today's scenario, it's not that China that has that capability. Russia has recently tested that capability, and India tested an ASAT weapon in March 2019. And I think when India tested, since I've been studying India's space program for a long time, India was always very concerned of being seen as a country that is responsible, is a country that would never militarize space, no matter what others did. And so very civilian focus, very careful not to bring its military and civilian infrastructure together, including launch systems. But then when China tested its ASAT, I think India's strategic community realized that Indian critical infrastructure could be taken out. And Indians are depending more and more on such infrastructure. So when India tested the ASAT under a very nationalistic government who thought about space as a power structure, the argument given by the Prime Minister was that today India has arrived as a space power. And the explanation was that the ASAT is not just a counter space capability, but a counter value capability. So they made the argument that we can use this capability to take out an adversary infrastructure as well, right? So anyway, I mean, I deviated a bit, but in terms of dual use capability, that is a serious concern that I think need to be taken very, very, very much into consideration.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I appreciate your discussing that because, you know, now bringing it back to the Space Force then, and it sounds like this goes into this changing military doctrine that space is no longer a safe haven. Maybe, especially for people, you know, like myself to some degree, who are concerned about the militarization of space. I think the Space Force then may be just a recognition that space has already been militarized rather than a move to militarize it. Would that be a fair way to put it?
Yes, it's actually an excellent point, because the moment we have infrastructure that supports conflict, we have militarized space. It's not weaponization. So I think people conflate weaponization with militarization. We have an outer space treaty that obligates states to not put weapons in any celestial body, weapons of mass destruction. So, and so 110 nations have signed it. So we do have regulations that are in place today in terms of weaponization of space. But then, of course, the Outer Space Treaty also made the point that military personnel can take part in any activity for peaceful purposes. So if you have a military Air Force astronaut, that's not illegal. And so my point is that the moment you started using space for supporting military command and control, precision navigation guidance, missile tracking, you have already militarized space. And I think the establishment of the Space Force is based, and so this is what again is important, is that the establishment of the Space Force does not automatically mean space is militarized. It already was.
It already was.
Yeah, so what it does is that it basically brings different agencies within the government into a single unit or an organization, so that there is no lack of coordination. Acquisitions become much more streamlined. The Space Force commander has a presence in the Joint Chiefs of Staff, can actually talk about space. And I think the Space Force, and I think the reason the Space Force actually came into existence, as I studied the literature, it started so much back. It started around 2000 from the Air University, where there was I think there was a captain, I'm forgetting her name, who wrote about it, the importance of organizations coming together, given the fact that space is going to become so important in terms of civilian and military infrastructure. So it's a very long conversation. And so, and again, those within the military that actually talk about Space Force, including Colonel Coyote Smith, who's retired now, if you look at their arguments, it's not about talking about, having military, like a huge conflict in space. It's all about securing commerce. It's all about maintaining free lines of communication. It's all about rescue operations in case something goes wrong. So the role of the Space Force is not just about fighting conflict. it's also offering humanitarian assistance in case something goes wrong. So I would say that I don't think it'll lead to more militarization. It already exists today, the level that we see.
Wonderful. Well, I think that's probably all the questions I had, but I do want to close by asking, what comes next for you? The book comes out October 15th, and I'm wondering, where do you see yourself going after this? What are your plans for the future? And have you guys discussed a second book?
Well, so it's great you asked that question, because our book is, as you know, is the hardcover is coming out October 15th. And so we're looking forward to that. But so I was approached by an academic publisher right after I finished this book that I thought I'll take a vacation and, you know, disappear for some time. But I enjoy writing, and I enjoy talking about. So for me personally, I'm very interested in clarifying concepts like power, justice, order, international relations concept, and grand strategy and strategic culture. So the next book project that I am writing, which is already with an academic publisher, is on China's grand strategy and notions of territoriality. So it basically talks about how China views notions of territorial expansion, including its border areas, and also in terms of looking at, say, a settlement or a resource structure on the moon. So this actually connects to our conversation today. So one of the concerns I have as a person following China for the last 20 years, including their border conflicts in India, China, India, Bhutan, the South China Sea, Antarctica, is that there are certain things that come very clearly from Chinese thinking. And that is that China is very much prioritizing first presence rights in, say, the South China Sea or Antarctica or China-Bhutan, the border conflict. Their argument is that because we were there first, this is our territory. And if you look at the territory, they are mostly territory that are rich in resources. So China claims an area in India called Arunachal Pradesh, which is very close to the area I originate from. And so that particular area is, again, very rich in resources. But they argue that this area was part of Tibet historically. But you know that their occupation of their administration in Tibet is questioned by the Tibetan population. So that's number one. So the argument I make is that, first of all, an area which is rich in resources, if China has invested money to get there, and if China wants to become the lead nation in, say, space, the concern is that what kind of normative framework would that lead to then? So would it be a framework that would support everybody's right to it, or would maintain some limits? Or would it be a framework that would prioritize a Communist Party of China-led world order? And if you listen to President Xi's strategic thinking, including Xi's thought, which is now very popular in China. So his argument is that by 2049, China has to become the lead actor in space, because if you become the lead actor in space, you have the most impact on geopolitics on Earth. So very clear articulation of grand strategy. So he connects space, he doesn't compartmentalize space. Space is connected to the overall national rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. And what is so interesting for my next book is that that kind of similar discourse exists vis-a-vis China's notion of territory, including Taiwan, Hong Kong, as we see today, including certain areas in Russia's Siberia. So Russia-China also has problems in their border. And so you can see that that kind of discourse is very much relevant. I don't want to give more away, but so that's the book that that's the next project. And
Wonderful.
The final project, and the final project I have is to clarify what space power means.
Okay.
Yeah, so again, as I mentioned before, so when you talk about space power, in my definition, which I'm still working on, is that power, which is drawn from the historical discourse of Robert Dahl and the rest, is the ability to influence someone to do something they don't want to do, or the ability to influence someone to do something that is in your interest. And by extension, space power is the ability to project presence and capability that influences someone or persuades someone, that's a better word, to not do something that they want to do. For instance, attacking a satellite that you do not want to be attacked, because you can then inflict punishment. Or say there is a base on the moon by an American citizen or an American private company, and a Chinese private company is creating problems to its life support system. And so space power is then the ability to inflict punishment for such behavior. Mm. And so I make a difference between a tactical understanding of space to a more strategic understanding of space power. But I'm still working on that in terms of clarifying it for myself and